David Bahnsen is with us now. He is the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, wealth management firm with over $3 billion in client capital. And he's got a great piece, a comprehensive primer on the Fed and inflation on National Review. David, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
What does everyone need to know about inflation? It's numbers, math. People can kind of say, yeah, I guess it is what it is. It's going to be pretty bad. Why does this matter to folks?
Well, the number one thing I want people to understand is that inflation is not new all of a sudden in the last year for a combination of reasons. It really isn't just one thing. But for, let's say 4 or 5 different things, the inflation number got noticeable. People feel it now. And yet, ideally, if you're a central banker and a politician who wants to live above your means, the greatest way to deal with that excessive debt is to inflate over time at a number that will not offend people, cause them to do what we're doing now, right? Getting up in arms about it with 5, 6, 7% inflation. So if you can just do 2 to 3% every year, you're still going to get to borrow $100 and pay back $70. It's a pretty good deal. You're going to inflate away 30% of the value over a certain period of time, and that's why politicians like inflation. But I think that people have to understand that we are dealing not merely with an inflation problem where right now food and gas prices have gone up. We're dealing with a problem that existed way before Biden and way before COVID, and that is no economic growth. We have averaged half of our annual growth rate that we were used to since World War II. We've averaged half of it since the financial crisis.
David, how do we get our growth rate back up? Obviously, that's been a massive political landmine for years and years. And also, this is kind of a second part of this. How do you do it? How do you get the growth rate back up with not, at this point, accelerating inflation simultaneously? Because that seems to be a really difficult putt to sink.
Yeah, well, let's start with that second one because it's a really important thing economically, and this is sort of the thing I'm most passionate about. Growth is not inflationary. Inflation is inflationary. Having too much money chasing too few goods is inflationary. Having more goods and more services is not inflationary. Production, what we call the supply side of the economy, this is what Ronald Reagan did, is he boosted the supply side of the economy, and it was counter-inflationary because we had so much more activity, more wealth creation, more goods and services. That is not inflationary. And this whole idea, what they call the Phillips curve, where, well, if people are making more money, that must be inflationary, and full employment is bad, it creates inflation. It is not true. Now, what you want is non-inflationary growth, but growth in and of itself is not inflationary. How do you create growth? It's called incentives. Humans want to grow. Humans want to act. This is how God made us. But what you have to have is the right incentives. And our whole economic framework in our country for 100 years has been based on incentivizing people to consume. It's nonsense. Do you wake up every day needing to be told to eat a good breakfast or really enjoy your dinner? We don't need incentives to consume. We need incentives to produce. And this is how you get the growth rate up. You get an energy sector that wants to compete with Russia and Middle Eastern oligarchs. You get a tax structure, a regulatory structure that motivates people to start new businesses. That's counterinflationary. That is what the need of the economy is.
David Bahnsen with us now, founder, managing partner, chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group. He's got this piece up at National Review, comprehensive primer on the Fed and inflation. David, how bad do you think inflation's going to get this year, and how much of this is really attributable to Democrat policies, regulations, and actions, particularly in the last 12 months or so?
So I'm going to say something that makes a lot of my Republican friends upset and then is going to make my Democrat friends, if I had too many of them, really upset. I actually do not think the biggest cause of the inflation has been the Fed and has been Biden's huge spending bill last year. I do think it's government policy. But I think it's rather than just that extra liquidity they let slosh around, which quite candidly, after the first round of people spending it, it really kind of stops getting spent. We have what's called a very low velocity of the money. The problem was the labor shortages, that we incentivize people to not work, to not go back to work, to not work more hours. And I think that is a government policy problem. And it was incredibly inflationary because we were unable to meet the demand that was inevitably going to surge after they finally reopened our economy. I don't think the actual headline inflation rate goes a lot higher from here. But what's going to happen, in my opinion, is it will come down near the end of the year, but it will, and what we call disinflation, the rate of inflation is still going higher, but it's at a lower level than the year before. Okay, so let's say you get 4 or 5% inflation. Well, that's lower than 7, but it's a lot higher than 2. And that's where we were before COVID. Actually, they couldn't even get to 2% before that. So ultimately, I think that what we're going to see is the Fed take a victory lap, that they brought the inflation rate down from what it was, and yet it's still going to leave us with higher food prices, higher energy prices, because they haven't got to the core of the problem, which is supply side.
David, there seems to be an expectation now, or at least increasing expectation, that we may be headed for an inflation, based on the challenges that the Fed is going to have trying to bring down inflation.
A recession.
Also, recession. What did I say?
You said inflation. Yeah. You mean recession.
Yeah, we've already got inflation. Do you think we're headed for recession, or do you think we're going to be able to avoid it?
Well, I don't know that they'll be able to avoid it, but here's what I believe. The Fed will blink. The Fed will blink. I do not believe that the Fed is going to be willing. Now, will it be too little, too late? It's very possible. But I think that the history of the Fed going back to the late 90s, where they coined this term, the Greenspan put, I think that once credit spreads widen, once the stock market starts getting hit, all things that haven't really happened yet, when they start happening, I think all of a sudden the Fed will find a way to chicken out. We have got to normalize monetary policy, but the reason is not just because of inflation. The reason is that it is totally unnatural. It's distorting economic activity. It leaves the Fed without any bullets in their gun. What if we have a real emergency? Like COVID, a financial crisis, a 9/11, these different things that have happened over the last 20 years. The Fed can't do anything about it if they're all at 0% or 1%. They have to normalize, but they're so afraid of disrupting the housing market, the stock market. And so I don't know if we'll end up seeing a recession or not. It's hard to predict that with 3 or 4% unemployment. And yet I do believe that if they don't address the supply side of the economy, then even if we don't see recession, we're going to see really unimpressive growth. And that's frankly just as bad for our kids and grandkids.
David Bahnsen, founder, managing partner of the Bahnsen Group. David, thanks for being here with us on Clay and Buck.
Thanks for having me.
We've been talking about a fantastic study. In fact, we opened the show a couple of hours ago discussing an analysis that had been done of the health-related issues, schooling for children, and the economic impact of shutdowns, lockdowns, whatever you want to classify them as. And one of the 3 authors of that study is University of Chicago economist Casey Mulligan, and he joins us now. Fantastic work that you guys did, Casey. Sort of take us into the methodology. How long did you spend putting together all of this data? And what were your overall conclusions for people who may not have read the study? It's up at clayandbuck.com. You can read it in the Wall Street Journal. It's up at Outkick. It's all over the place. It's spreading like crazy. Congratulations on the work. Take us into your methodology.
Yeah, we wanted to look at each of the states independently because we had kind of a federal system where governors and even mayors had a lot of say-so instead of the federal government directing. So we thought we could learn by comparing the different states, also the District of Columbia, so we have 51. And we looked at, measured their mortality from COVID and generally. We measured their economic activity by their GDP and their unemployment rate, and then we measured schooling, which was how many of the public schools were open. And interestingly, there was really no relationship between having a vibrant economy and having lots of deaths. people thought maybe that if you let your economy be open, like maybe Florida did, you would get extra deaths from that. Doesn't really bear out really at all. The one exception being Hawaii. Of course, it's an island, unlike our other states. They really did isolate. Their economy's in bad shape even as we speak, but their mortality has been a lot lower. So Hawaii was able to, they gave up a lot, but they were able to get something. But otherwise, these states, typically blue states, they gave up a lot of economic activity, didn't get better health for it.
So can you tell me this one? How are, I should say, people coming at your study, Casey? I mean, what are they saying? How are I always find it's useful in these moments to look for what the critiques are so we can know what your response would be, right? I mean, I mentioned before, just from a quick read, this isn't a critique of the study, but state by state, you always will hear people say, well, South Dakota has a per square resident level approaching, Polynesia, right? I mean, it's not a very well populated place, so it's not fair to compare New York City to South Dakota. But that's just more of the states, and you do that with all the different places you do. What are the criticisms of the study, and what are your responses to them? Because, as you know, this is a very contentious topic.
Well, I think you raised what I think is the number one concern, which would be the population density, that you have states, and they also tend to be blue, where the population's densely packed in there, New York, New Jersey, and it would seem that the disease would spread quickly. And we agree that the disease would tend to spread quickly at first. But we measured everything over 2 years, so the virus had plenty of time to make it to rural areas. In fact, it did. In fact, and then we're not the first ones to find this. Scholars of disease have always had trouble finding cities to do worse, at least in the modern era for cities to do worse. They do at first, but it's mainly an issue of timing. The rural areas tend to get these diseases just at a later point in time, and we have the luxury now 2 years out of looking at that.
We're talking to University of Chicago economist Casey Mulligan, who wrote one of the co-authors of a fantastic study getting a lot of attention today across the media landscape. All right, so Casey, based on the data that you have seen, both health, schooling for children, and also overall economic impact, we were fortunate to have effectively, thanks to federalism, shout out to the founders back in the day who recognized the value of federalism. And this is one of the greatest, I can imagine, laboratories that we've ever had for federalism. As you mentioned, 51 different localities, if you count Washington, D.C., all implementing some version of different policies as it pertains to COVID. Casey, if you, based on the data that you've looked at, sort of exhaustively studied here, what was the best response? This is one of the things that, as we come out of COVID, what did we learn from the way that we responded to it? What was the best possible decision that could have been made? What state and or states did the best job, based on your data, in balancing all of these different competing equities?
Well, keeping schools open, very clear now. I think it was pretty clear early on, but we all can admit now that closing the schools didn't help, maybe even hurt.
Yeah.
Disease may spread less in schools. This particular disease may spread less in the schools than it does, say, at home, because the kids have to go somewhere, of course. So we just put a huge burden on kids and really no dividend from that at all. I think that's pretty clear. Your top states in having schools open. Wyoming had all the public schools open for the full academic year that we looked at. Florida was very high on that. Arkansas also high. And your blue states were quite low. Hawaii was one of those that had their schools closed a lot, and I think that makes no sense. I understand the idea of closing the islands from the rest of the world, But you got your island closed. Why can't you have the schools open? There are no cases on your island. Why do the kids need to stay at home? So,
very good question, Casey. And we're going to put a link up at clayandbuck.com to your work here, a final report card on the state's response to COVID-19 by Phil Kerpen, Stephen Moore, and Casey B. Mulligan. That'll be up at clayandbuck.com shortly. We'll put up the link, Casey, to your actual study so folks can see it for themselves. I think it's important that they have access to the primary source material in case they have some agitated lib neighbor who wants to say this isn't even a thing. So that's a great way to get it out there. Thank you so much for being with us, Casey. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We're joined now by first guest of the day, Bryan Dean Wright, former CIA ops officer and host of the President's Daily Brief, a new podcast debuting this week. Bryan, you used to be a Democrat. I certainly know how that feels, and you feel like the party lost its mind. What was the tipping point for you in deciding that the Democratic Party no longer made sense for you?
In the past couple of years, I saw a few different things. One was a bunch of very anti-American or un-American talk. I remember very vividly Governor Cuomo of New York saying that America has never been great. Well, that's not really the right thing that any political party should talk about in the country unless you're trying to destroy it. And then I saw a lot of bigotry-based commentary coming out of folks who were elected at our national level, Ilhan Omar and some of the squad members who were very anti-Semitic in their views. But moreover, they represented and embraced things like socialism and communism and that kind of stuff. Going back to the roots of my family's connections to the Democratic Party, we were Jack Kennedy Democrats who, of course, stood up and said no to the radical left and in a party and in country, in the world. So I just saw a very, very consistent drift away from what I understood to be the classic presentation and embrace of the Democratic Party, particularly for workers. We're now seeing Democrats embrace big tech and big corporations, some of those woke agendas. And so me and a lot of other conservative Democrats, particularly in rural areas, said, all right, we've had enough. We're becoming independent or we are becoming Republicans.
Hey, Bryan, it's Buck. I'm wondering how you assess 1 year in to the Biden presidency. One thing Clay and I talk about with a fair amount is how it doesn't seem like there's really anything they can point to that is a success. Is this, in your mind, as somebody who, as you've said, used to vote Democrat, is this a moment of awakening for a lot of people who maybe were on the fence in 2020 and now see through results just how ruinous a Biden presidency is? I mean, basically, do you think there's a lot of voters' regret out there for people who are independents or who just barely broke for Biden?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head. If you look at the polling for independents, and I'm sure we all know anecdotally and our friends and families, they're all saying, look, President Trump, he did a lot of great stuff. Maybe some of his personality just couldn't stomach. So either I didn't vote or I did go ahead and pull the lever for Joe Biden. But my goodness, I regret it. My father actually falls into this category. So there are definitely people in this country who I think are very gettable by smart people, smart politicians who represent thoughtful policies. I hope that those people choose conservatives. But I think we have to get this man, Joe Biden, and this wing of his party out of the office because they don't believe in the goodness of America. Now, what I will tell you is on the left, you're not seeing a lot of degradation of progressives, that wing of the party. They're pretty tight still with being both Democrats and identifying and supporting Joe Biden and his administration. So I don't see the drift from the left or the far left yet. They may stick at home and not vote. Let's see. But I think that they're in this thing. This is a revolution on the left that we've been experiencing really for the past 20 years. The woke stuff, the emphasis on racial identities and divisions, the tribal parts of politics, especially racial tribal politics. Democrats have bought that hook, line, and sinker, and that is not a hysteria that they're going to abandon anytime soon.
We are talking, appreciate him making the time for us. We are talking with Bryan Dean Wright, former CIA ops officer. What do you think when you look at what's going on in Ukraine? How much of that, you mentioned that some people are questioning their decision to support Biden over Trump, including your dad. How much do you think of what's going on in Ukraine right now is pegged to Biden's weakness, particularly in Afghanistan and also just around the world in general? We haven't talked about it much, but Saudi Arabia's got their version of SNL making fun of Joe Biden in a way I never remember them ridiculing a president before. How much of all that is connected?
Yeah, so two things. One, if you look at a very stark fact, which is the people in the Pentagon and in the White House are the same folks who designed and executed our 20-year war in Afghanistan and lost. They are all still there, and they are now putting together our plan and executing it for a war in Europe against the Russians, a nuclear-armed state, not a bunch of sheep herders or goat herders in Afghanistan. All right, so that's kind of a big deal. We should probably be talking about that more and figuring out, hey, should we have a change of our own regime in this country, both in the Pentagon and at the White House, maybe even the CIA, some of that intelligence leadership, the ODNI's office. So I think that's where we have to first clean house. The second question is, so how does the world view us, right? Is that important? At some levels, it can be, but ultimately, we lead from the front, not from behind. So I think that the world is seeing failure on our part and the West in terms of the run-up to the war in Ukraine. Everybody knew it was coming or should have. And then we sat back and we just let it happen. I mean, if you recall, Joe Biden told President Zelensky that basically he should step down. He should look at asylum in other parts of Europe or even the United States. So I think that what you're seeing in Ukraine is really a failure of leadership in Europe, and it's a failure of the United States, of Joe Biden in particular. And now we're left with a mess, and there's no good way for anybody to get out of this.
Speaking of Bryan Dean Wright, former CIA operations officer, he's got a new podcast that just launched, The President's Daily Brief. You should go check that one out. Bryan, to that end, you were CIA, I was CIA. That name, that brand, that entity, institution, along with many others in the intelligence world, has taken an absolute beating in recent years. And people ask me, do you think it is something that can be reformed, or does it really have to be rebuilt, given all the stuff about Russia collusion, the deep state, the former directors signing that letter saying the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation? What do you think? Rebuilt or reformed?
I think it has to be rebuilt. And I think that we start with the same approach that we took back in the 1970s when the CIA and the intelligence community was out of control. There were a number of committee investigations into exactly what was going on. And there was actually decent leadership at the time that said, yeah, we acknowledge that there's a problem. Let's put it all out on the table. Let's be honest with the American people, and then let's fix it. So you have to have a change in the White House because the President of the United States, of course, appoints the person that sits at Langley. And then that person has to understand that the problem exists and then be dogged in trying to fix it. And then, of course, you have to have oversight, both in the House and the Senate, that recognize there's a problem and wants to fix it too. So all the levers of power have to be in unison and have the uniformity of belief that things are bad. The data or the stories or both are pretty clear that things are really screwed up in the intelligence community. And from my view, I think from a lot of us who've been former officers and were watching the politicization of our intelligence community, our brothers and sisters who damn well know better. They know that they shouldn't be doing this, but they're doing it. So I think it can be fixed. The question is, what kind of leadership do we have to do it? Not going to happen now. And let's see if a Republican or a conservative gets into office next time, if they have the backbone to get it done.
Bryan Dean Wright, everybody. Check out his new podcast, The President's Daily Brief. I'll be giving it a listen. Bryan, great to have you, my friend. Come back soon.
You got it.
Senate candidate in the great state of Arizona, Blake Masters, is with us now. Blake, thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So I just want to have you react to some of what Biden said yesterday about ghost guns as somebody who has actually built a firearm at home on your own. But first, here's what Biden said yesterday in his speech.
The NRA called this rule I'm about to announce extreme. Extreme. But let me ask you, is it extreme to protect police officers? Extreme to protect our children? Extreme to keep guns out of the hands of people who couldn't even pass a background check? Look, the idea that someone on the terrorist list could purchase one of these guns is extreme. It isn't extreme, just basic common sense.
Do you think it's basic common sense, Blake, to ban these guns and take these actions? What do you say?
I do not think it's common sense. It's what the Democrats always say, right? Common sense gun control. No, it's actually just about disarming law-abiding gun owners, right? It's about making it as hard as possible for you and me and everybody listening to this program to own and use and, make firearms. Most people don't realize, but for our whole national history, even before 1776, including the colonial days, it's been legal for Americans to make firearms at home. You don't have to ask the federal government for permission. You don't have to go pass a background check. You can make guns at home. That's been legal, and now it's under assault because Joe Biden wants to make it harder to do that. It's about disarming people. It has nothing to do with crime.
Blake, why do you think we spend so much time talking about guns as opposed to the people who actually commit the crimes with the guns?
Well, basically because Democrats don't care about crime. If they did, it's like we do have a gun violence problem in this country. It's handguns, and it's mostly gang violence, right?
Yep.
It's gangs in Chicago shooting each other. It's people in St. Louis, right? Like all these Democrat-run towns, and Democrats don't do that, right? They don't want to clean that up. They like the George Soros-funded prosecutors who don't want to prosecute anybody, right? By making it about guns instead of about criminals, it gives the Democrats license to go after me, to go after you, to go after any law-abiding gun owner, because ultimately they want us to become Australia. They want us to become Canada. They know that a disarmed society is easier to control.
Blake, we're speaking to Blake Masters right now, Senate candidate in Arizona. You are in a border state, as you well know, and things look like they're going to get even worse than they currently are when it comes to illegal immigration and the overall lawlessness at our southern border, which, of course, includes the massive importation of fentanyl into the United States and other opioids, which resulted in tens of thousands of Americans dying of drug overdose last year alone. What are your expectations for how this is going to affect Arizona? And also at a political level, what is the Biden administration play here? Clay and I have been pushing that around on the show, trying to figure out how do they think it's anything other than an abject political nightmare for them to have up to 18,000 illegal crossings a day?
Well, the first thing they do is they try to deny that there's a border crisis, right? And they're just hoping that they can get all these people in and give them amnesty. I really do think it's as simple as they like the open border. They like the chaos that it causes. They want millions of people to come here so they can import a new electorate. That's what Joe Biden is thinking, to the extent he's thinking anything at all. What's interesting now is, they're going to repeal Title 42. And so, if you thought we had a crisis now, just wait till May and June. It's about to get a lot worse. But, my opponent here in Arizona, Democrat incumbent Senator Mark Kelly, he's voting for all the open border stuff, but he has the audacity to now pretend to be moderate. He's saying, no, please, Mr. Biden, don't repeal Title 42. That would be bad. And he's trying to have it both ways. They want to deny that their policies are causing this border crisis, and then they want to pretend to be reasonable. Most people in Arizona, though, see through it. People are just sick and tired of the open border. It's literally ruining our country.
Blake, you've got a lot of experience with companies, with running businesses that actually have to make money as opposed to just spend money, which is what our government does. 8.5% inflation today, the highest in 40 years. What should be done to bring inflation back down where it's not becoming a tax on everyone out there who is living paycheck to paycheck and isn't fundamentally destroying many different American lives from an economic perspective?
Yeah, the first thing to do is to just stop the bleeding, right? We cannot keep spending trillions and trillions of dollars. It means don't fund this crazy Biden agenda, right? It's, Build Back Better. Thank goodness they didn't get it passed, but they did get the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package passed, right? Trillions and trillions of dollars. And of course, it just makes the problem worse. They say inflation is 8.5%, and that's a high number, but what's the real number? If they admit it's 8.5%, you and I both know it's well into the double digits when you actually factor in properly the things that people need, like gas, housing, right? Food prices, all this stuff is double-digit inflation. And I think as long as you have a Democrat in the White House and a Democrat-controlled Congress, it's just going to get worse and worse.
Blake, how could this get turned around? I always try to find, especially a day like today, there's a lot of bad news, a lot of stuff coming in that's either awful or disappointing or any number, depending on whether we're talking about the economy or the violence in New York, or there's so many different things going on at once. But if we're going to turn this around, and, the midterm elections are going to be here before we know it, Republicans won't be really in a position to pass a lot in the sense that they won't get it signed by Joe Biden, most likely, but they can at least start to talk about the agenda and hopefully in 2024 be in a position to implement it in a really meaningful way. On an economic front, what does that look like? I mean, I think it's clear to everybody the Democrats aren't good at this. So how can Republicans tell everybody what will they do that will make them better, that'll actually make the situation of the economy improve?
Yep. Well, step one, we retake Congress, we make Biden a lame duck, and you block his agenda, right? Then you're just not contributing to the problem. And then we use those 2 years, like you said, to really prepare for winning back the White House in 2024. And, President Trump showed us the way here. His America First economic policies worked. Not only did we have low inflation, I think it was under 3% every year in the Trump administration, but median wages actually started to rise under President Trump, right? The amount of money that everyday American workers were taking home went up under Trump for the first time in decades. And so the America First policies, which are pro-business, but also pro-worker, right? Making sure we have good trade deals, making sure we're actually making things here in America again, and we're not just, dependent on China for absolutely everything like the Democrats want us to be. Those sorts of America First policies, they work. It might take 2 or 3 years to really get it done because the Dems are causing so much damage. But this stuff works. And if we retake Congress and retake the White House in 24, I know we can have a successful American future.
Blake, we were talking yesterday about the fact that there's a general consensus now that Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Nevada all will decide 2022 and 2024. You're talking about taking back the House and taking back the Senate. What are you seeing on the ground in Arizona right now, and how optimistic are you about Republican gains in 2022 in your state?
I'm very optimistic. I do think we're going to have some sort of red wave because the Democrats, frankly, are blowing it so badly. Although I always caution people, don't get complacent, right? If you think there's going to be a red wave, maybe you'll just slack off and not do the hard work that it's going to take to create that red wave. So we have to act like the underdogs. We have to play like we know the stakes. The stakes that we're playing for are the whole future of the country, right? But if we work really hard, if we just get so upset, and I'm telling you, the voters that I talk to, Republican voters, but also independents, they're so upset at what's happening. If we channel all that and run really strong candidates, I think we'll be tremendously successful in November and beyond.
Blake, I don't know how well you know Elon Musk, but I know there's a lot of overlap between Peter Thiel and a lot of the guys that you've worked with in your capitalistic career in business. What advice would you give Elon as it pertains to Twitter if he came to you, and maybe he has come to you and said, hey, what should I do now? I'm sitting here with 9.2%. I obviously support, Elon does, the First Amendment. Twitter is not a free open marketplace now. What should be done? What can be done? What would you tell him in terms of Twitter?
Yeah, I love what he's doing. I hope he increases his stake. Elon came to my book party, and he's called 0 to 1, the book that I wrote, one of his favorite books of all time. He's just a breath of fresh air, and I'm glad, frankly, that Elon decided not to join Twitter's board. I think the Twitter board wanted him to join, right? It was kind of this keep your friends close and your enemies closer kind of thing. But now Elon, he doesn't have to follow all the rules, right? His ownership isn't capped like it would be if he were on the board. So now he can just pressure for the reforms he wants, and if he doesn't get them, he's a very wealthy man. He can buy up more and more of Twitter. I'd love to see him buy 51% of the company and just control it and let President Trump back on, right? And free speech. Everybody used to believe in this. Turns out today only conservatives do, only Republicans do. And I think Elon is doing great work here.
Blake, if people want to learn more about your important candidacy here for the Senate seat in Arizona, where should they go?
BlakeMasters.com. Very simple, just my name, BlakeMasters.com.
That works. Blake, thanks so much, man. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Talk soon.
Here are some words of insight from our next guest. If Joe Biden is found to have profited from Hunter's business deals or used his position as vice president to benefit his family. Schoen wrote here in this piece, what is now likely is a red wave election that could turn into a massive blowout that is more substantial than anything seen in recent history. That is Miranda Devine quoting Doug Schoen, a Democrat, in her latest piece in the New York Post. She's the author of Laptop from Hell, New York Post columnist Miranda Devine with us now. Miranda, always great to have you.
Great to be with you, Clay and Buck.
So it always feels like when the Democrats start to recognize that what the right is saying or the conservatives are saying is true, and they're saying it only because of the political liabilities they face, that there's perhaps a reckoning coming. How is this moving along as it pertains to Hunter Biden, the laptop, the investigation? People in this audience are pretty familiar with the basics on it, so where are we now, and how does Tony Bobulinski play into all this?
Well, look, I think you're absolutely right. The only reason that the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN and so on are paying any attention to this story or admitting that the laptop is real 18 months after we broke the story is because the Democrats are now starting to wake up and, I think, panicking about what is coming down the pike from the grand jury that's been investigating Hunter Biden. And partly you can see their mindset because all these left-wing media organizations and Democrats and the White House are, yes, admitting that the stories that we started running 18 months ago from the laptop are real and the emails and so on are authentic, but what they are also trying to do is create this new narrative in which Joe Biden is completely firewalled away, quarantined away from the mess of not just his son Hunter, but his brother Jim Biden, with their running this influence peddling scheme for the family internationally while he was vice president. So, but that is really not a sustainable narrative because what we're seeing, the morsels that are coming out of the grand jury investigation, and I mean, that's really hotted up. They've been interviewing a lot of Hunter Biden's associates, his business partners, his ex-girlfriends, his baby mama. And I'm told that witnesses are being asked, who is the big guy? And that means that the grand jury is starting to ask questions, starting to pull on the threads that lead to Joe Biden, to the president, because the big guy is the name that Hunter and his partners used to refer to Joe Biden. It was sort of their code name. And we know that, I mean, the name is littered throughout the laptop, but also Tony Bobulinski has come out and said, he was one of Hunter's business partners, he said that was the name they used for Joe Biden. And so I'm told that Joe Biden is a focus of the grand jury investigation.
Miranda, thanks for making the time to come on with us. It's always fantastic. So if you're told Joe Biden is part of the focus of this investigation in the grand jury, to me, what that ultimately means is Joe Biden himself might get subpoenaed to testify in front of this grand jury. Have you heard any discussion about that? I would love, by the way, there's a lot of media that listen to this show, I would love for the White House to be asked and see if they're willing to go on the record whether Joe Biden would comply with that subpoena or whether he would fight it in court. What do you know about the chances that Joe Biden himself, a.k.a. the big guy, may get called in front of that Delaware grand jury? Do you think that's likely? Have you heard any discussion about that?
No, I haven't. I think it's unlikely, just gut feeling, but who knows? I guess it just depends how far these investigators want to go. They certainly have a trove of material. They've been subpoenaing bank records. We know from the laptop that there are a lot of clues about commingling of finances between Joe Biden and his son Hunter, shared bank accounts. We know that for instance, there's one email in which Hunter Biden's sort of partner, the president of his firm, Rosemont Seneca, talks about accessing an account where Joe Biden's tax check has gone. He says, I'm going to deposit that tax check. I'm going to write or write a check, I think, for you for that amount from Joe Biden's bank account. They were, money was going backwards and forwards. We know that Hunter Biden was paying for over several years, paying bills for Joe Biden, for upkeep and maintenance on one of his Delaware homes. He was paying a phone bill, and there's other material. There are sort of strange bank accounts that are referred to with strange names, referred to by Eric Schwerin, this partner. He used to do Hunter's tax returns. He used to help out Joe on paying his mortgage. So, we're just seeing that with very limited visibility on the material that's on the laptop. There would be, for investigators with subpoena power and visibility into all those bank accounts, and if there are any offshore accounts, they would have a lot of access to that. So I don't know what they have exactly, but all I know is that they are looking at the big guy. And we also know that the White House has not come to grips with this story because, just in the last couple of weeks when they're asked a few questions at press conferences, we've had two different White House spokespeople say just absurd things like, yes, we stand by what the president said in that debate when he said Hunter Biden hasn't received any money from China. That's just not true. There are bank trails. Johnson and Grassley, the two Republican senators, have been putting up just in recent weeks some of those bank details, $6 million here, $5 million there. That's just not sustainable. And then there was another question they were asked: does the president stand by his campaign vow that he knew nothing about his son Hunter's overseas business dealings? And the White House is still standing by that. So they obviously, someone has not sat down with the president and said, you need to tell us what's going on so that we can answer these questions. But again, I don't think there's a lot of pressure from the media. What you're getting from the Democrat-friendly media is these attempts to whitewash the story, to keep Joe Biden out of it, and to just quarantine him from the muck that's coming out from his son and his brother.
One quick one for you, Miranda. And Miranda Devine's Laptop from Hell is a book you should all check out to get really up to speed on all this one. What is the possible next piece in this? We're talking about the 10% for the big guy, CFC in China, and how it was essentially a front for the Belt and Road Initiative of China, and how using influence peddling ties into our biggest competitor on the global stage here, buying off now the first family in essence. What is the next bit of information that, if proven, you think takes this from a crisis the White House and the media can ignore, as much as they are still trying to do so, to full-on political DEFCON 1? Like, what is the next thing we have to find out when they can't ignore it?
Well, I mean, there are so many bits and pieces, but one is any evidence coming out to show that Joe Biden intervened in the decision to fire Viktor Shokin, who was the Ukrainian prosecutor who was investigating Hunter's paymaster.
Which he bragged about on video for everybody. The video's out there, yeah.
Yeah, he bragged about it, but also it seemed that there was a change in State Department policy. Why did that happen? Is there evidence to show what swayed Joe Biden and made him sort of, do something quite risky and intervene in this case?
All right, Miranda, thanks so much. Miranda Devine, everybody, New York Post. Miranda, appreciate it.
Thanks so much.